Rabbi Michael Marmur is our scholar in residence this weekend. How lucky are we? He is the professor of Jewish theology at Hebrew Union College, a leading figure on the Jerusalem campus, a much sought after and admired scholar, and really a favorite teacher among rabbis and rabbinical students the world over. He has a new book out called Living the Letters, and throughout the weekend he's been sharing little glimpses of this remarkable book, each chapter devoted to one of the letters in the Hebrew alphabet. Now, when Rabbi Michael Marmur comes to teach at Holy Blossom, of course, we are reminded of his father, and we hear echoes of Dov's voice. Rabbi Dov Marmur was our senior rabbi from 1983 to 2000, and there are many people in the room who still think of Rabbi Marmur as their rabbi, and still remember Rabbi Marmur as their own dear friend. Many times visiting with the Marmur family in Jerusalem, I got to see Dov in his happy place, which is not only the city of Jerusalem, but also Shabbat in Jerusalem at Kol HaNeshama, our sister synagogue, our Reform synagogue in Jerusalem, sitting next to his son Michael. That was by far Dov's happiest place. And so I've been introducing each of Rabbi Michael Marmur's teachings with a snippet of his father's teachings so that we can see the branch from the tree from which the branch grows, although it's apparent in every word. Michael has become the scholar and the teacher that he is, I should say, of course, through his own hard work, his own brilliance. He's earned it all for himself, and some has also been inherited from his parents, Dov and Freja. And Freja just celebrated her 90th birthday. So Rabbi Marmur, Dov Marmur, has this book entitled On Being a Jew, A Reform Perspective, and the very first chapter is relevant to the themes that we're about to hear from his son. The title of the first chapter is The God of My Parents, the God of My Children. And Dov teaches about the words that we've already said many times this morning, Eloheinu ve'Elohei Avotenu, our God and God of our ancestors. Why do we say that? The Amidah, the central prayer of the Jewish liturgy, includes the words, our God and God of our ancestors, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, and God of Jacob. The traditional answer teaches that God is the same, and the individual has to find God for himself or herself, and therefore is bound to perceive God differently. God does not change, but since each person's perception is different, individual, and very limited, one can, at best, only fathom the reality that is God. Thus, God, who is always the same, is different in the perception of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and all the prophets, sages, scholars, and ordinary folk who came after them. Tradition is the sum of these experiences, and yet also incomplete. It beckons us to add our own. So, Rabbi, Professor, Dr. Michael Marmur, please come and add your own.
Shabbat Shalom, Rabbi Splansky. It's unnerving every time you bring, for each of my talks, some words of my father, and he's always stolen all the best lines. It's a great pleasure to be with you. I am indeed going to say something about God, about the existence of God, and I will say that I was stimulated to do so in sad circumstances, listening as I did to the funeral of Marvin Tile, members of whose family are here with us, a giant of this community, and I would say a giant in our own Marmur family's pantheon. And there was a discussion, a thread through that funeral, which was extremely moving in many ways, as to what Marvin was when it came to God. And different You'll be pleased to know I don't plan to give you the answer to that question. I wouldn't possibly feel that I was equipped to do so. But the question was he an atheist? Was he an agnostic? Was he a Spinoza Jew? Where did he stand on the God question? And what I want to do, to some degree in his honor, is relate to that question now for the next few minutes. When I say in his honor, were he here, I have no doubt that he wouldn't agree with one word of it, but it would be such a pleasure to debate it with him afterwards. When I get up in the morning, I recite a formula which which existed for many centuries. It perhaps came into being in the Jewish liturgy for technical reasons, because there's a problem in the rabbinic worldview in uttering a blessing in the full form, invoking the word of God, before one has gone through all the appropriate ritual ablutions. And so there was a word that sidetracks, a sentence that sidetracks the Baruch Atah Adonai formula, and instead it says, Modeh ani lefanecha melech chai v'kayam. I give thanks before you, Chai v'Kayam, a God who is alive and exists. And I've thought about those words, recited so often. Hebrew offers all kinds of layers of possible interpretation. The term lefanecha doesn't only mean I give thanks unto you, but it can be understood as meaning I give thanks to the different faces of you. I give thanks to the different possibilities that are made possible by you. I give thanks to your multifacetedness. My father, in the words that were quoted before, makes a good point. We're a monotheistic religion, one God, right? That's what it says on the side of the tin. But for all of our monotheism, there is a great deal of variety in the way that God is described. In this week's Torah portion, a phrase, Adonai Elohim, in various versions, gets used on 34 different occasions. Now, if there's one God, there ought to be one name for God. But here, in the book of Deuteronomy and in other books of the Hebrew Bible, God gets two names, Adonai Elohim, and it's more complicated. The first of those is pronounced in polite company Adonai, but that's not what the letters say. The Yud Hey Vav Hey formula seems to have at its root the notion of radical existence. Right? You're talking about being in some abstract form, whereas the word Adonai that is uttered is a hierarchical term. My master, someone who's in charge of me. Two very different ways of thinking about who God or what God is. So the first thing I want to say then is that we should celebrate and not only be puzzled by the multiple ways in which our monotheistic tradition has grappled with the question of God. Let's look a little further at another term in that morning formula. Modeh ani lefanecha melech chai v'kayam. That second phrase, chai v'kayam, triggers in me a childhood memory. You'll be surprised to hear that I was brought up in England, and in my Jewish school we were taught a song that many of you may know. The lyrics are simple. David Melech Yisrael Chai v'Kayam. We would sing it with great gusto. The words are not that difficult to understand. David, the king of Israel, lives and endures. But what was never clear to me from the age of 7 is what the point was of this song. Either David, the king of Israel, lives, or David, the king of Israel, doesn't live. Right? Surely existence is an either-or proposition. And therefore, me singing about it with great gusto isn't going to make any difference. But it turns out, as I was to learn, that there's more than one way of being alive. There's a midrash that tells of King David, whose coffin, this may sound macabre, but this is the Midrash is often pretty gruesome in its imagery. Solomon, his son, brings his coffin in the most fantastic circumstances. Solomon has performed the same error that many of us who've been engaged in DIY over the years might be aware of. He's designing the temple, but he's created a piece of furniture which is too wide to fit through the doors. He brings the coffin of his father David and beseeches God. He says, I've brought the big guns. At which point the Midrash says, David came to life, implored that some mechanical engineering feat be achieved, and the problem was solved. That's one way, if you like, in which it could be said that David was alive. Here's another way. The institution I work at, the Hebrew Union College, has an archaeological school. And probably our most famous and consequential find happened in our excavations in the northernmost part of Israel at Tel Dan. We found there an inscription. It's actually a stele. A stele is a stone statement that was put there by the King Hazael approximately 3,000 years ago. Okay? The fact that it's a stele in the site of Dan means it is the original stele Dan, if you're interested in that. Now, that statement is remarkable for a number of reasons, but none more than the use of the expression Beit David, the house of David. Why is it so remarkable? Because until that discovery, the only evidence we had for the historical existence of somebody called King David was our own mythology, our own stories that we tell ourselves. And many scholars and historians of the period were and continue to be very keen to argue that there was no such thing as King David. It's just something we made up to further our claim on the land or whatever it might be. Therefore, discovering in archaeological evidence, ancient, this is about 100 years after King David were to have lived, and here you have a local potentate talking about the house of David as something that everybody knows about. Here's another way then in which David, Chai v'Kayam, David lives, because we have some attestation to the notion that he actually existed and isn't just a figment of our national imagination. The phrase David Melech Yisrael Chai v'Kayam has another resonance in our tradition. We're told in a passage of the Babylonian Talmud that when there's a disagreement as to whether when the new month is to begin, the sage who sees himself and is regarded as the authoritative spokesman for rabbinic authority sends one of his juniors to a particular place, and he is to declare there David Melech Yisrael Chai v'Kayam as code in order to say, A, this is when the new moon begins, and B, we're in charge. It's a statement of sovereignty and if you like, of a claim to political authority. And that's why in my Zionist Federation school in London in the late 1960s, we were singing David Melech Yisrael as an echo of the same notion that here in a period of renewed Jewish sovereignty, we were tapping into that tradition. So even though the question of whether David is or is not alive may seem like a simple yes-no question, it turns out that it's much more complicated. David is alive in the rabbinic imagination when his name is invoked by his son. David is alive when the historians suggest there's some evidence that he actually lived. David is alive when David's heirs look to him, turn to him, and instantiate him, bring him to life in some way. Now, so far, I meant to be talking about God, but I'm talking about King David. Why? Because it's exactly the same expression, Melech Chai V'Kayam, that is used both to refer to the flesh and blood, lots of flesh and lots of blood, if you know the stories of King David, the flesh and blood King David. The same expression is used there as it's used to describe God, which sounds fairly heretical. But of course, in the end, all we can ever do is use our human language and our human imagery as we turn to think about God. This was expressed beautifully by Ludwig Feuerbach in the 19th century, who said something like, if birds wrote theology, God would have wings. The point being that we are bounded by our own bodies and our own imaginations and our own linguistic field, and therefore when we come to express the inexpressible, when we come to the ineffable, all we can possibly do is use the world of experience that we have. And so that expression is found every morning. Melech Chai V'Kayam. Do I really think God is a king? And what do I mean when I say Chai V'Kayam? I want to suggest that the duality of that expression gives us a way of understanding how different people think about God. By the way, I'm less concerned now for the question of whether you accept God or reject God. I'm more interested in knowing which is the God that you're rejecting or accepting. Is it, for a moment, Melech Chai, the living God, a God with whom you have a personal connection, a God who gives you personalized instructions? Or is it a Kayam, a God of existence, described by some theologians as the ground of existence? Right? Not a personal God with whom you can have a back and forth conversation, but a God, some ordering principle of the universe. Melech Chai V'Kayam is not only a particular expression that's used to evoke the name of God, it offers us a way into thinking about the infinite range of possibilities that our tradition suggests to us. It would be a mistake to think that Jews have always held with the same God idea. It's not true. It's not historically accurate, and it doesn't reflect the reality we know of. Within each one of us, I want to suggest, there are all kinds of debates and uncertainties that are alive on these big questions at any given time. And certainly within the community, you'll find in this room every possible variety of thought and belief when it comes to the question of God. There was a sociological survey that my father was fond of quoting. It was a book published in the 70s in England. I think his name was David Hay, was the researcher, where they asked people to define themselves. Are you atheist, agnostic, or believing? And then they asked the same people to say, have you had an experience you would describe as a God encounter? And here's what happened. 30% of the people who were asked said that they had such an experience. 30% of the atheists, 30% of the agnostics, 30% of the believers. Think of the 70% of those who describe themselves as believers who did not do so on the basis of some personal experience that they had, but for other reasons. everyone in our family calls themselves a believer, or I have an intellectual, I've come to the conclusion that there must be a God in the universe, or I wasn't paying attention when the question was asked, or who knows. And think of the 30% of people who are dyed-in-the-wool atheists, but they have had experiences they could describe in no other way as an encounter with the sublime and the divine. Life is more complicated and more messy than the categories and definitions that we choose. I want to offer one more kind of way of thinking about this God question by challenging the idea that what matters most is where we stand on whether God exists. I want to describe this as Wizard of Oz theology, and I'll explain to you why. Think of the plot of The Wizard of Oz, which in my opinion is a great parable about modernity and religion and all sorts of things. What happens towards the end of the movie is a moment of disenchantment where we discover that, and this is a spoiler for any of you who haven't seen the movie, there is no Wizard of Oz, but instead there's a somewhat portly, balding, I have nothing against portly, balding men, by the way. I warm to them in all sorts of ways. But there's a little guy behind a screen who's working some mechanism. So what do we discover? To the question of whether the Wizard of Oz exists, the answer is no. It's a manipulation. It's a fabrication. It's a fraud. If the God question is the same as the Wizard of Oz question, then we can go home early and skip Kiddush. It's too trivial a question. Surely the things that we care about most in the world are not subject to the simple exists, doesn't exist criterion. Now, I'm not arguing that in some kind of great flood of postmodern theory that's never a good question. Sometimes it is important to know, did your political leader say that thing, or did they not say that thing? Did they deliver on this or that question? Truth is, in some cases, a binary proposition. But very often it isn't. If somebody asks you, does love exist? You are going to have a lot of trouble, it seems to me, putting it to the Wizard of Oz test. Finding out whether it's a fabrication, a self-suggestion, a manipulation, a hormonal response, or whether it really exists. The range of vocabulary we're going to need to grapple with the big questions is bigger than a simple yes or no. There is a radical Catholic theologian called John Caputo who has an interesting idea to challenge this notion of talking about whether God does or does not exist. He says, I'd rather talk about a God not who exists, but who insists. And this is what he writes. To speak of the insistence of God is to say that God is a provocation, an insistent disturbance, a solicitation, a visitation by a stranger, like a call knowing I know not want, or an insistent knock on our door in the middle of the night. The insistence of God, he writes, means the insistent problem, task, challenge, obstacle, hurdle, question, and barrier that goes under the name of event, an idea I keep coming back to, circling round, refining and defining, but without trying to be too confining. The name of God is the name of the chance of an event for grace. He's a Catholic theologian, so there's a lot of, he has grace before meals. But that spells, he writes, trouble, a problem, to which the world and our being in the world are a series of shaky solutions. I want to suggest for our theological vocabulary not just to ask the question, does God exist, and then you give the Wizard of Oz answer. But to ask yourself the question, does God, however you perceive of God, as Chai or as Kayam, as a personal commanding voice or as some abstract theoretical presence, what does this God insist? What does this God push, pull you and each of us to do? Abraham Joshua Heschel gave Jewish expression to a similar idea when he wrote these words: "The ultimate question bursting forth in our souls is too startling, too heavily laden with unutterable wonder to be an academic question, to be equally suspended between yes and no. We can no longer ask, is there a God? In humility and contrition, we realize the presumption of such asking. The more deeply we meditate, the more clearly we realize the question we are being asked, that man's question about God is God's question of man." So, alongside the question of is God or isn't God, the binary Wizard of Oz existence question, I want to suggest we grapple also with the insistence question. And it's a very difficult question, because look at the world we're living in at the moment. Look how many people are motivated by a God who insists that they do this or that dreadful and unforgivable thing. Surely, the argument would be, we would be better off taking out an existing God from the equation altogether. But I want to say no. I want to say that the only way we can best respond, or well respond, to an increasingly fraught, fractious, and crazy world is by matching the extremism of some believers with the profound moderation of our own belief. It doesn't have to be less deep just because it's less, to use a technical term, bonkers. We need actually to face up to the question and ask ourselves, what does our God insist that we do? How should we respond in the face of an increasingly impossible reality? Later on tonight, this is a promo, I'll be saying something more about things to which I believe a Jew today might be bound. Some ways, or some answers to the question, what is this insisting God insisting? But we don't have to answer all the questions in each of these sessions. You've got to leave a little something for later on. So let's settle now for this attempt of mine to include in our vocabulary not just a God who does or doesn't exist, but a God who insists. And to ask ourselves, what is that God insisting of us? The sense in which David Melech Yisrael Chai v'Kayam, the questions of sovereignty, Jewish sovereignty and power, is now playing out in our world in dramatic and highly challenging and awful ways. Indeed, there are great debates between all of us about how the sovereignty of David, of how this moment of political life in Israel and in the world in general, how it ought to look and how it can look. It is perplexing necessarily to grapple with the question of God's insistence. Some people will hear that insistence and rally against the government, and some will hear God's insistence and rally fervently in favor of it. Some will hear God's insistence and give up in Israel as a lost cause, and others decide that their God is insisting that they should make it their life's cause. I continue to praise a God who has multiple faces and who is perceived in multiple and sometimes contradictory ways. We have to look to the world, and we have to look to Adonai Elohim, Adonai Eloheinu, the God who we experience, and the ideas that we develop and posit. You may not think that God insists. We may not think that. But may we, each one of us in our own way, experience the call of a God who insists. Shabbat Shalom.